We continue the series on responding to a fractured world. Rethink, react, recreate. And our special guest today is Chris Doran, and his theme is climate migration from a Christian perspective. Let me tell you a little bit about Chris so you'll get an idea of the enormous expertise he brings to this session today. Chris is a native Californian, and his studies have been multidisciplinary. His BS was in biology at Seaver College, Pepperdine University, then a Master of Divinity at Pepperdine, and then a PhD at the intersection of theology and science, which he did at Berkeley, that has highly specialized work in that field, or in that multidisciplinary field. He's been teaching at Pepperdine since 2007 in the Religion and Philosophy division, where he is associate professor. Chris has been a highly innovative teacher and has done many things since 2007, responding especially to the dangers and challenges of climate change. At Pepperdine, he developed the sustainability minor in 2016 and the sustainability major in 2021. This whole program, the sustainability program, is the largest multidisciplinary program in the history of Seaver College. So you get an idea of his skill to build things and build things that will matter to the world. In this past year, he's also been developing a climate change program for churches. And he's done that as a project with students. He did this on the ground project, building, working with the students and working also with Pando Populus, which is an organization that sprung out of the Process Network and has generated projects across Los Angeles County, especially with college and high school students and other bodies like congregations. Chris's book, Hope in the Age of Climate Change, has the subtitle, Creation Care, This Side of the Resurrection. And you already get a sense of the kind of work he does. He explores how, in this book, he explores how the resurrection of Jesus should inspire Christians to be leaders rather than followers in responding to climate change. And he also is working on a current research project that explores a Christian theological response to human and non-human, or more than human, migration and displacement due to the climate crisis. So the climate crisis has been a focal point for him all these years, and he has continued that work in what you're going to discover now is outstanding work in that climate crisis and reflection on what might be possible. Chris, we look forward to you. Thank you so much.
Well, Mary Elizabeth, thank you for the very generous introduction and greetings to all of you. What I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about the phenomenon of climate migration and then chat a little bit about two of the false narratives that I believe that we live by in the developed world that need some radical adjustment or transformation quickly. And then we'll have plenty of time to discuss more about this project or the book or whatever you'd like to in the Q&A section. But let me just start with this. Using biblical imagery, the British journalist Guy Evans argues that the four horsemen of the Anthropocene are likely to make the planet unlivable for billions of humans. Fire, heat, drought, and floods are changing the ways that people live now and threaten to push the limits of human adaptation in the very near future. For example, the floods that killed thousands in Libya in 2023 were caused by a storm that was up to 50 times more likely due to climate change. As we careen our way towards a 3 to 4 degrees Celsius rise in global mean temperature, our ability to successfully adapt, at least in the sense of living as developed world citizens have become accustomed to over the last 100 years or so, will become far more difficult, if not impossible. As one group of scientists has discovered, by as soon as 2070, somewhere between 1 and 3 billion people, that's a billion with a B, may be living outside of the climate niche. That is the very small range of temperatures on Earth that has served humanity so well over the last 6 to 10,000 years. While using apocalyptic language is certainly effective in creating a mental landscape that is dramatic, we must acknowledge that there are more than the 4 extreme climate consequences to concern ourselves with. In particular, we must not forget one that will likely change the physical landscape for billions of people as well, and that's sea level rise. While global mean temperature is on the rise, it is not nearly as high as it could be because much of the heat being trapped by the climate gases we are putting into the atmosphere is in the planet's oceans. And our oceans have stored a lot of heat over the last few hundred years. As one scientist puts it, the oceans have absorbed the heat equivalent to 7 Hiroshima atomic bombs detonating each second, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. This hot water is working its way underneath some of the most notable glacial structures in the world and causing them to melt, and rapidly so. The speed at which the ice sheets of Greenland and, more importantly, those of Antarctica continue to melt will change the way that billions of people live on the world's coastlines and the flat areas that are often near coastlines around the world. The ice sheet that is holding up the Thwaites Glacier, which is roughly the size of Florida, is melting faster than we expected. That glacier alone contains enough ice to raise global sea levels by 10 feet. The problem is not just that this hot water is causing significant problems for these glaciers, and not even to mention the marine ecosystems surrounding them, but also that the hot water expands and takes up more space than cold water, which also causes more sea level rise. Even if all global carbon emissions were to stop today, feet of sea level rise will still happen because glaciers do not stop melting overnight. That sort of environmental change might take hundreds of years, if not longer. Some of the world's most significant cities historically, like New York, London, Mumbai, Lagos, Shanghai, and San Francisco, and others, will be irreparably altered by sea level rise. But it is not just the cities themselves. The flat plains that are near a number of coastlines around the world, for example, the whole eastern seaboard of the US, will also be inundated by rising oceans. While the great cities of the world may garner more publicity when it comes to understanding the impacts of climate change, sea level rise is likely to make a number of low-lying island nations completely uninhabitable as early as the middle of our present century. Nations like Kiribati, the Maldives, the Marshall Islands, Tuvalu, and Vanuatu, just to name a few, face this inevitable fate. These climate consequences will force people to migrate. The United Nations International Organization for Migration defines climate migration as the movement of a person or groups of persons who, predominantly for reasons of sudden or progressive change in the environment due to climate change, are obliged to leave their habitual place of residence or choose to do so either temporarily or permanently within a state or across an international border. Just as we should be critical of economists and social commentators who contend that people migrate only for economic reasons, we should not be naive to think that all climate migration is reducible to a singular climate-related reason. Instead, we should remember that the reasons for migration are always varied, but upon reflection, there tend to be primary factors that drove the final decision to move. I submit that climate consequences are, in fact, some of these primary reasons for what so many are now calling climate migration. According to some, we already live in the age of migration, with hundreds of millions already migrating around the planet. So what makes climate migration so different? The most significant reason is magnitude. We already know that climate change is a threat multiplier. It makes any global problem like poverty, social inequality, or war worse. The World Bank, for example, suggests that in just 6 global regions, there are likely to be as many as 216 million people moving within their own national borders due to slow onset climate events by 2050 alone. The African Climate Mobility Initiative projects that the number of African internal climate migrants, meaning those who do not leave their country of origin, could reach 113 million by just 2050. If these estimates are anywhere near accurate, this is human migration unlike anything we've seen in the history of our species. Sadly, though, these are the more conservative estimates. Other groups estimate that 1 billion people now occupy land less than 10 meters above current high tide lines, which will be impacted by even the most conservative estimates of sea level rise. The Peace and Economics Institute estimates that 1.2 billion people in only 31 countries are likely to be displaced due to climate consequences by 2050. Another group at Cornell suggests that the number of humans displaced by climate change is probably closer to 2 billion by the end of the century, which would be like the approximate populations of China and India having to move from their current homes in the next 75 years. While this number of people moving seems incomprehensible, it fits with the conventional scientific understanding that with every 1 degree Celsius of temperature rise, 1 billion people will likely have to move. Skeptics assert that these numbers often sensationalize and highlight worst-case scenarios to attract attention and with it governmental action, which downplays the potential for climate adaptation generated by human ingenuity and technology. History, however, has shown that even our best climate models have been far too conservative in their projections. The planet is indeed warming faster and in many ways more unpredictably than we expected. We must prepare for the number of people migrating to be far higher than we would expect or perhaps even comprehend. I do not believe it is hyperbole when Guy Vance says, quote, "Human movement on a scale never before seen will dominate this century and remake our world. People will have to move merely to survive." Contemporary migrants are fleeing or leaving their homes because of a number of difficult situations that are unjust, whether those be related to climate change, war, political persecution, religious conflict, etc. This is just one form of injustice. As another scholar says, this is not the only injustice that migrants face. They also face the injustice of the situation that they find at the borders of the new nation in which they are attempting to gain entry. Far too many migrant or refugee camps at international borders lack adequate sanitation, housing, medical support, psychological support, translators, along with many other deficiencies. The basic necessities that so many developed world citizens take for granted are either not present or not prioritized for those on the outside of national borders. Researchers describe the grim reality of the likelihood of death is much higher for those waiting at the border to enter a new country than we would care to admit. Many countries, including the US, do not even officially count migrant deaths at the border because they are not citizens of the receiving nation and are not required by law to do so. Climate change, unfortunately, does not impact everyone the same way. We know that it disproportionately impacts women, particularly as it exacerbates historical, societal, gender inequalities. For example, when sudden onset disasters like cyclones happen, women in Southeast Asia are more likely to be injured and less likely to survive due to a lack of available information, literacy, mobility, and decision-making agency. Additionally, these disasters can frequently leave families so impoverished that they are forced into terrible decisions in situations like selling their daughters into sexual slavery in order to feed the rest of the family. Extreme heat not only increases the incidence of stillborn children, but also the spread of vector-borne illnesses that are linked to maternal and neonatal outcomes. We also know that the rates of gender-based violence against women rise during and after climate-induced sudden and slow onset events in both the developing and the developed world. Furthermore, migration in general disproportionately impacts women. Climate migration thus is no different, especially when it comes to gender-based violence. For those of us in the Judeo-Christian tradition, this should remind us that unfortunately little has changed since ancient times. As one scholar puts it, Sarah's willingness to go to extraordinary lengths for the couple's survival has many parallels with those migrants today who subject themselves even to sexual exploitation to preserve themselves or their families. So what's the problem? Well, one problem among many is that far too few people across the planet are talking about this. Most conversation about climate migration is being done by a few humanitarian groups, an array of military analysts of various developed world governments. One single short document by the Vatican in 2021 represents the only significant public effort by a Christian group to discuss climate migrants seriously. American churches, especially Protestant ones, just are not talking about this. And since Southern California is already home to so many migrants, it stands to reason that not only are some climate migrants present in our communities already, but more are likely to come. So what I'd like to do is to suggest two false narratives that we in the developed world tend to live by that impacts the way that we even conceive of migrants right now and the ability to perhaps stand in solidarity or to be hospitable to them in the near future or in the present. So false narrative number one, fearing the stranger. Whether we acknowledge it explicitly or not, one of the biggest narratives developed world citizens tend to live by is it is necessary to fear the strangers around us. From teaching our small children the phrase stranger danger to being subliminally cautious around those who do not look like us, humans often live as if people we do not know are likely to become belligerent or even violent at any given moment. This inaccurate narrative about strangers can not only influence the way we talk about the phenomenon of climate migration, but also skew the very way that we view actual climate migrants who might be living in our midst. We do not have to live by this narrative, but in order to do so, we need to think more about its origin. The scientific consensus is that most, if not all, human behavior is the result of a combination of genetic and environmental factors. Therefore, it may be too facile to say that xenophobia is a purely learned or cultural behavior. That said, it could cause some shame to think that xenophobia, as well as racism, sexism, and bigotry, has genetic roots that we are not fully conscious of, regardless of how kind and compassionate towards others we believe ourselves to be. Part of this is likely caused by the fear reflex that is hardwired into our brain's amygdala and activates when we encounter something unfamiliar. This reflex likely was an evolutionary adaptation that has some important benefits for our ancient ancestors. For instance, being fearful of strangers might prevent you from having your resources stolen, being attacked, or being introduced to a new disease. On the other hand, trusting those who looked more like us because they were likely related to us could allow for us to reciprocate good deeds and increase our chances of passing on our genes to future generations. Even as we have become more organized into complex societies, the fear of the stranger is unfortunately still a pronounced feature of human interaction. As one scholar puts it, there are at least three types of fear when it comes to how developed world citizens typically understand the massive flow of migrants we see around the planet today. While the scholar is primarily speaking about mass migration due to globalization, her insights, I believe, apply to climate migration as well. Those three categories are political, cultural ones, economic welfare ones, and security or existential threat ones. For this first category, political cultural fears are rooted in the belief that migrants pose a risk to the established country's very political and cultural identity. Some developed world citizens presume that civil order is maintained by citizens of a nation holding on to these jointly held assumptions and principles about their nation. The idea is that without a critical mass of citizens with these beliefs, the political and cultural identity of the nation is at stake. The fear is that too many migrants can theoretically upset the critical mass balance and hence lead to a dissolution of what supposedly holds the nation together. In other words, what an established community believes itself to be could possibly be threatened if there are too many migrants allowed within its borders. The fear can manifest itself in many different ways, from saying something like things aren't the way they used to be, to both xenophobic and racist attacks on migrants themselves. The second set of fears are related to the economic health of a nation and what that provides for the welfare of its citizens. It has become quite common in the global north to hear that migrants are taking jobs and social services away from native-born citizens. The presupposition being that the economy is a zero-sum game and current citizens lose their jobs because they are undercut by migrants who will often work for less money than native citizens. Moreover, the dominant narrative of many established nations, includes that migrants using social services like access to public schooling, healthcare, charitable gifts, etc., while allegedly not contributing financial resources back to the coffers of the established nation. The final set of fears are categorized as those that are security fears or existential fears that established nation citizens have when it comes to what we think about as national security, but also our own personal security. It has become all too common in a post 9/11 world for political leaders of developed world nations, whether in the US or elsewhere, to claim that migrants must be restricted from entering because they are terrorists who threaten national security. As for personal security, an all too common narrative is that migrants are dangerous because they're disproportionately responsible for criminal activity, especially violent crime like assault, rape, and murder. The escalation of this sort of fear can be seen in both urban centers as well as suburban ones. Moreover, citizens in the global north for generations have suggested that migrants harbor more medical illnesses than their own communities, and so we should be leery of widespread transmission of disease in places where migrants tend to congregate. Susanna Snyder contends that all of these fears and probably more exist in something that she calls an ecology of fear. Quote, in short, an ecology refers to a material and ideological environment in which mutually reinforcing patterns of thinking, feeling, and acting define relationships between individuals and groups. Ecology indicates a space within which different kinds of encounter can happen, end quote. It is within this space that Snyder asserts that a number of things, like how political leaders talk about migrants, how the media covers migration, public acts of hostility towards migrants by established nation citizens, geopolitical security, governmental policies on migration, and latent fears can all participate in a malicious circle that magnifies our anxieties and fears into something far more debilitating and likely more dangerous for both those in the established communities and migrants themselves. Snyder goes on to argue this ecology of fear in the developed world is neither accidental nor spontaneous. It is intentionally generated and stoked by those in the established communities who benefit from it. According to Snyder, this stoking is done primarily by politicians and governments who formulate the very policies that can create and sustain the fear established communities have about migrants, whether it is through the policies themselves or the rhetoric used to describe migrants. Political leaders often shape the public discourse about migration. And why would they not? The average citizen expects their government to handle an enormous issue that is migration. Moreover, Snyder asserts that the developed world political leaders have come to realize that migration issues can be key to winning political elections, and thus scapegoating migrants for the seeming ills of a society can be helpful in attempting to generate some sense of national unity. Fear of migrants can be used as a political tool wielded for many different ends. Politicians and governments may be primary players in the ecology of fear, but they are not the only substantial actors. Snyder goes on to assert the media are also culpable. The agenda may be set by the government and political elites, but the media interprets and presents this agenda to the public. So while other parties can influence the ecology of fear, things like corporations, judicial branches, lobbyists, public opinion, etc., these two, she argues, reign supreme in the developed world. Political government leaders and the media itself. While some of this work does not address climate migration directly, two scholars recently have argued that there has been a white backlash against Latinos migrating in the US, especially those entering the country via the border between the US and Mexico for the last 50 years or so. It is critical for us to understand their immigrant backlash theory because the majority of climate migrants most likely to arrive in the US through the southern border at least will be Latinos from either South or Central America or Mexico. First, these two scholars argue one of the reasons that immigration has become so central in the politics of individual white Americans is its almost overwhelming magnitude. Second, an immigrant threat narrative is what tends to stoke fears and anxieties about Latinos, whether they be immigrants or not. Third, immigration has become attached to a number of other societal issues that have nothing at all to do with immigration. And finally, the dominant immigrant threat narrative is becoming increasingly coupled with politically partisan policy choices. These scholars convincingly argue that the two mechanisms which allow this backlash to take hold and eventually grow are geography and media consumption. If one lives in a part of the US where immigration appears to be more pronounced, for example, citizens believe they see more immigrants living in or around their hometown, then they tend to exhibit anti-immigrant attitudes and behaviors. For example, think about those who live near the southern borders of Arizona, California, New Mexico, or Texas. Also, because media sets the agenda of what is news that is covered or not and frames much of the immigration narrative for the average US citizen, media consumption is critical in predicting anti-immigrant attitudes and behaviors. Those who tend to consume right-wing news media tend to exhibit more of an immigrant backlash mentality than those who do not. So how does this apply to climate migration? We must not be naive to the extent of the problem. While the political rhetoric of the day may suggest otherwise, the political party affiliation of the US president means little to the thousands attempting to make their way, whether via the Darien Gap or some other way, to the US. Most of them make their way by the same means as our common ancestors, by foot and by boat. While the perception of migrants attempting to cross the US southern border is definitely magnified by the ecology of fear, the actual number of people attempting to enter the US is nothing like migration that the rest of the world faces on a daily basis. North America just does not have the same amount of people on it as the continents of Asia and Africa. That said, the likelihood of an increase of migrants from primarily Central America and Mexico fleeing their homelands due to climate-induced increased heat and drought, and hence the consequent inability to grow food, is extremely high. The reactions of some governors has demonstrated the sort of partisan reaction predicted by scholars in this field. Some Republican governors believe that paying for the transportation to send some of these migrants to states with Democratic governors is a way to demonstrate a failed immigration system. To me, this appears like treating these migrants as political pawns rather than as dignified children of God. As Pope Francis put it so eloquently a few years before he died, migrants and refugees are not pawns on the chessboard of humanity. They are children, women, and men who leave or are forced to leave their homes for various reasons, who share a legitimate desire for knowing and having, but above all, for being more. So let me turn to a second false narrative that I think is important for us to address, and that is the concept of the Westphalian idea of nation-state sovereignty. The false narrative about nation-state sovereignty and how that allows us to think about national borders is a particularly pernicious one. I do not think that very many developed world Christians, and American Protestants in particular, understand the origin of this idea that we tend to treat almost as an eternal precept and thus nearly sacrosanct. Political scientists and international relations scholars typically trace the birthplace of the modern notion of nation-state sovereignty to the end of the 30 Years' War in Europe at the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. This essentially ended the feudal system of governance in Europe and precipitated a transition to the state model we see across the world today. The Westphalian principles are commonly understood to be at least the following. Each state is sovereign over its own determined geographical territory and the domestic affairs within. States are to refrain from interfering in other states' domestic affairs, and each state, no matter its size or power, is equal under international law. It bears explicitly reiterating that what so many contemporary political leaders and nations rely on when conceiving of statehood is a fairly recent historical phenomenon. The 17th century was not so long ago when considering the long history of human civilization. So while rivers and mountains or other physical markers historically indicated the territorial borders of tribes, governments, or empires, those boundaries were not accompanied by the philosophical or political language that comes with the notion of borders in the way that we tend to commonly think of them today. Moreover, our ancestors certainly had no concept of the considerable reach contemporary states often exercise politically, economically, technologically, clandestinely, and otherwise to tamper with or violate the sovereignty of their global neighbors, both near and far. That said, it is fascinating how contemporary political and social rhetoric in the global north often speaks about state sovereignty in such absolute terms. While it seems that many developed world nations live by a narrative that state sovereignty is an immutable law of nature or natural right, it is not. The Westphalian notion, excuse me, of state sovereignty, and along with it the concept of geographic borders, is decidedly a social construct. It is fascinating how natural we tend to think state sovereignty is, even though it has been invoked and subsequently violated countless times over the last few hundreds of years. For example, during the historical participation of so many Western states in the transatlantic slave trade, or the expansion of the borders of the US by violating the sovereignty of so many indigenous peoples, or the American expansion into Mexico. Additionally, the concept of state sovereignty seems less than immutable, considering the indigenous forms of geographical sovereignty are typically far different from that which rose from Westphalia. State sovereignty is definitely a false narrative that we live by in the global north. Climate change seriously threatens the ostensible confidence that global community has historically placed in Westphalian principles. If nothing else, climate change is teaching us that state sovereignty is indeed a social construct, and a rather tenuous one at that. In reality, no nation is sovereign any longer over its own borders and domestic affairs because heat, drought, sea level rise, and wildfires show no respect for national boundaries, however they are defined geographically. For example, the current Canadian wildfires and the smoke they cause do not respect the geographical boundaries between the states within the US and Canada. The principle of non-interference is nonsensical when we think about the physics of greenhouse gases moving around the planet and the consequences of them oftentimes being far away from those who originally produced them. Nations like Tuvalu and Kiribati and Bangladesh, for example, might question strongly how they are viewed equally under international law, since they have some of the smallest national carbon footprints on the planet, and yet are the ones bearing some of the most significant existential threats from sea level rise. So for the purposes of our present discussion, let's constrain ourselves just a moment to examine the concept of borders as a critical part of what it means for a state to consider itself sovereign. When it comes to discussing borders, we developed world citizens frequently find ourselves making statements that lead to viral sound bites, as well as the validation and perpetuation of injustice more than anything inspired by fairness, charity, or mercy. We typically use simplistic bifurcated language. Are you for open borders? Are you for closed borders? If you indicate that you're supportive of more border security, then you might be shouted at for being a xenophobe and not caring about those fleeing desperate situations. If you say that you prefer more migrants enter one's country, then you might be castigated for being an open border cosmopolitan who does not grasp what a flood of migrants will do to a country. I think, though, we should be mindful of Daniel Grudy, who's an interesting theologian in this field, when he says our choice of language is so critical. Binary choices like native or stranger, or in this case, open or closed borders, does not foster right relationships. And in this case, our usage of oversimplistic language about open or closed borders obscures a central question that I think Christians should be asking. What are the purpose of borders anyway? Reminiscent of the words of Jesus related to the purpose of the Sabbath was made for humans, not humans for the Sabbath. We should be asking, are borders made for humans or are humans made for borders? State sovereignty and the borders that are in some sense the physical representation of that alleged sovereignty have become an idol for far too many in the global north. And I'll just say, just as an aside, there's a whole section in a previous chapter about Reinhold Niebuhr, who I find to be very helpful in this. So I'll just be referring to that and feel free to ask questions later if I need to elaborate. But from a Niebuhrian perspective, it is understandable why we would view state sovereignty and the employment of borders as an idol. Humans are existentially anxious about our contingent nature and where we will be in the future. We attempt to mitigate, if not eliminate, that insecurity by exercising power that inevitably comes at the expense of other life. This insecurity at the individual level is magnified into what Niebuhr calls collective egotism at the group level, where the ability to accumulate and exercise power becomes even more pronounced. As the group accumulates more power in an effort to secure itself, it becomes even easier to exercise the sort of power that inflicts violence on others in the name of collective security. Military might and economic strength are just two of the privileges that developed world nations wield in defense of the security we believe that state sovereignty and its borders provide. The problem, however, though, is at least threefold. First, the sort of security we believe this idol of state sovereignty provides us is a false one. While we believe borders will secure us from the chaos of the outside world, it does not ultimately address the central theological problem, which is we are finite creatures, and contingency is part of our nature. Nothing outside of God can provide us with ultimate security. Perhaps in the words of Niebuhr, we should see that our idolatrous relationship to state sovereignty and borders are one of what he would call the most pathetic efforts to deny our finitude in the face of such uncertainty. And it is no longer geographical borders alone that we attempt to construct to make us feel secure. According to experts in the field, wealthy developed nations are now engaging in what they call a strategy of extraterritorialization, which is an attempt to push the control functions of borders hundreds, if not thousands of miles away from the geographical border of an actual country. For example, migrants might have to meet certain requirements at a foreign embassy in their own country to even attempt to move elsewhere, quote unquote, legally. If a migrant is far away, the thought goes, there's less to worry about at the actual border of a developed world country. Moreover, Niebuhr's doctrine of sin, I think, is instructive as well. Remember, human sin is never merely about our ignorance. We consistently attempt to hide the fact that we are finite by overestimating how clearly we see a situation and by masking our insecurity by stretching power beyond our finite limits. While this position was taken originally to explain the sin of an individual, Niebuhr argues it applies to groups as well. Developed world citizenship allows us to have selective amnesia about the injustice and violence that protects our privileges. In particular, we fail to remember that we are contributing directly to the circumstances that lead to so many of the climate situations that the global South faces. Furthermore, we consistently live as if our privileges are actually entitlements. For example, we in the global North believe that we are entitled to what state sovereignty provides, even if we do not fully understand historically how military might and economic power were predominant tools in constructing our borders in the first place. Our ignorance of history is not a sufficient excuse for sin. Second problem, our idolatrous relationship with state sovereignty is only further illustrated by climate consequences. Wildfires, hurricanes, extreme heat, etc. They do not follow Westphalian principles. Climate change and its myriad effects decidedly demonstrate that we are in fact finite creatures who lack the ability to provide ourselves with the security we so desire, and that we easily fool ourselves into believing borders will give us. Additionally, climate change is exposing us to the reality that state sovereignty is an idol that predominantly exists through oppressive behavior. In its Westphalian form, it only serves to maintain the privileges of the global North and simultaneously fends off climate migrants fleeing the global South. One of the most significant sacrifices we make to this idol are the people in the global South. Climate migration only highlights the tenuous, if not foolish, nature of state sovereignty and our idolatrous submission to it in the global North. When billions of people are migrating, Westphalian-style national borders will only continue to exist in many parts of the world through an increase in violence and the increase in violence it will take to sustain those borders. And finally, the final challenge here, the alleged security of state sovereignty is maintained because of privilege supported by injustice and violence. This should cause developed world Christians considerable pause. There are multiple layers of injustice and violence. There's the climate-related slow violence that causes people to leave their homes and become climate migrants to begin with. There's the gender-based violence that women, like those attempting to cross the Darien Gap, disproportionately face as they migrate away from their homes in an attempt to find new communities. There's the structural injustice and violence due to governmental policies that cause undue suffering for climate migrants as they wait at the borders for possible entry, as well as spontaneous acts of violence to these people as they sit in official and unofficial facilities waiting to potentially enter a new nation. There is the violence through words or deeds that climate migrants face once they enter into a new established community. Ultimately, developed world Christians must ask themselves carefully whether or not the concept of state sovereignty is less of a political reality of the modern world, or is it in fact a socially constructed idea that allows us to justify our global North privileges that we would prefer not to have to share with others. If this is the case, then we need to think about borders in a completely new way. The book goes on to look at the Christian virtues of hospitality, of solidarity, of courage, of justice, and of hope. I don't have time to cover all of those, but I think at this point I'll just stop and ask if there's any questions and turn it back over to Mary Elizabeth.
Thank you very much, Chris. You've given us a lot to think about. And I'm going to